Welcome. I'm your host, Cindy. Today we are joined by Victoria Adelman, formerly known as Victoria Bradshaw. Welcome, Victoria.
Hello, thank you for having me back.
It is such a pleasure. For those of you in our audience, you may have heard our previous episode where we talked about sports psychology and learned a lot. Victoria was also a part of the TEDx cohort we were a part of. I emailed her and I said, "Hey, Victoria, would you like to come back on the show?" And she said, "Yes." I'm very excited that you're game.
Always.
Something interesting is that Victoria recently got married, hence
Mhm.
the last name change. So everybody, let's give her all a big hand for this new phase of her life. May it bring many blessings and goodness.
Thank you so much.
So, Victoria, you're on vacation, right? You're a part-time lecturer in sports psychology at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. How's the summer treating you?
It's been amazing. This past year was my first official year teaching. It was my first full year, not being a PhD student anymore. I was officially a doctor at that point. So it was a lot of lessons and trials and tribulations, navigating this new chapter in my life and profession. It's been nice to take a moment and just kind of reflect on like how did it go? What did I do? What things can we maybe shift around a little bit so that this upcoming year is a little bit better? It's also been wonderful to have a summer break. So this is the first time in probably 21, 22 years that I've actually had a summer break. When I was in middle school, elementary school, high school, I was playing softball. And softball, when you play travel softball, is a summer sport. Summer wasn't really time off for me. Then you get to college and it's similar. You have your summer break, but you're still working on academics and practicing for softball. Wonderful things at the time. And then my master's program, my PhD program, those are kind of year round. I took summer classes every year as a master's and a PhD student. And even last summer, I was finishing up my dissertation, which is a whirlwind of emotions and a whirlwind of things. So even last summer, it was a lot of close that chapter of your dissertation and then start class prepping for Cal Poly so that you can be prepared for the classes that you're going to teach. And so it's been a blessing to have a summer where it's just been a summer, and I've gotten to do a lot of fun recreational reading. I've gotten to read Colleen Hoover, which everyone keeps kind of
Ooh.
boasting about. I've read 3 of her books so far. Yes, I know. My best friend and my landlord both were like, "You have to read Colleen Hoover. She's amazing." The movie is coming out. It Ends With Us, which is based on one of her books. That's the one I read first because I wanted to read it before the movie came out. And then I was hooked, and I've been reading a ton of books ever since then, and that's been really fun. I have not read for fun since
Ah,
probably before elementary school. As you're going through
wow.
school, all of your reading is for class or educational purposes. So it's been so nice to just read for the sake of enjoyment, which has been
Mm.
great.
I love that. I want to circle back to something you said in the beginning was that you just completed this year and you wanted to take a moment to enjoy yourself, but also reflect. And I thought that was such a key thing you said because we all need time to just be. And that's where the magic happens in terms of introspection, in terms of reflection. And it shows that you have that growth mindset that says, okay, this worked well, this did not work well. How do we pivot to make things better moving forward? And so I think that that's something that should not be understated. And I really appreciate that you said that, particularly because you just went through your first year of moving into being a professor, a lecturer,
Mhm.
a PhD after your years of study. During that time, you've had so many life changes. Not only did you go into the quote unquote professional working world, which you've always been working, but now without the attachment of being a student, you
Right.
prepared and delivered a TEDx talk, which is no small feat while it being your first year teaching. As someone who has taught in academia, I cannot underscore how much work you put in that first year, developing syllabi, developing content, and preparing your lectures, delivering, working with students. That first year is incredibly busy and overwhelming. On top of that, you did this TEDx talk and, did find time for personal life, which is you
Mhm.
planned a wedding and later got married. And I just don't know how you did it all.
Yeah, we had a huge support system around us, which I think is important in any new adventure, in any situation where you're navigating things. I think it's so important to have that strong support system around you. And I think that reflection piece also helped me a ton with everything. Being an athlete, I had a tendency to be really hard on myself. In some ways, that's human nature for us
Mhm.
to focus on all the things we did wrong or all the things that we should have done or could have done. And I very much have a tendency to go right into that mindset after things. At the end of the school year, it was really important for me to recognize what are the things that I feel like I did well. So I try and get
Yes.
myself into that headspace first. Like, what are the strengths I brought this year? What are the strengths I can continue to bring to the table? And then reflect on, okay, what areas do I maybe want to improve on? I had to do the same thing with the TED Talk. I remember walking off the stage after my TED Talk. You've been practicing for months. You have your outline of what you want it to look like, and you have it in your mind of exactly what you want it to look like. And then you go out there and maybe things don't go exactly the way that you had them written on paper, or exactly the way that you had planned it in your mind. I noticed myself really focusing on those things. Like, well, I didn't talk about this and I should have done this way. And this didn't go
That
exactly the way
mental
that I
chatter,
wanted to.
right?
I noticed I was instantly going into that kind of thought process and that thought cycle. So it was really important for me to take a step back after the TED Talk and reflect. First and foremost, you're the only person that knows what your script looked like. So no one
Yes.
else knows what you could have talked about or didn't talk about or wanted to talk about. But also take a second and reflect on you did this really incredible thing and it was scary and it took a lot of preparation and it took a lot of dedication and effort, and allow yourself to recognize that and allow yourself to recognize the strength that it took to do that and the strengths that went into that presentation. And then let's take a step back and ask ourselves, now that I've recognized that, what could I have done differently? How could I have prepared a little bit differently? That reflection piece continues to be really important for me. It's something I do with all the athletes I work with, all the clients I work with, and even something I push with my students. Is I think a lot of learning and growth happen in that reflection. It can be easy for us to walk away from something like TEDx and just be like, well, that didn't go the way I wanted, but that's all right. Life moves on. And
And
so when we stop and reflect, we learn.
And I really like that you practice what you preach. But in addition to being a professor, you're also a consultant, which was something I did not mention earlier. So I'll mention it now. You are a consultant. You do work with clients in terms of not just the physical aspects of training, but the mental fortitude and strength that comes with being an athlete. Having been an athlete yourself, you understand, the different mental chatters, right? The different times when, we're really hard on ourselves and we
Mm-hmm.
sometimes our self-esteem goes down, but also the times when we are on a self-esteem high because our performance was everything we wanted. It can go in so many different directions. You are not just a sports psychologist, you're an athlete yourself. You understand that. So you do work with your clients in that aspect. I appreciate that you're reflective yourself, because how can you work with somebody and ask them, hey, don't be so hard on yourself if you're hard on yourself? As
Mm-hmm.
the mentor, the coach, the psychologist, I think it is vital to practice what we preach, because it not only shows our humanity, but it shows that we understand your struggle because we also go through those struggles. This is how we navigate it.
It gives us that personal experience, especially when I'm thinking about my work as a mental performance consultant. I think it's important for me to understand exactly how breathing techniques work and utilize those when I'm feeling overwhelmed, stressed, or anxious. I have that personal experience and I know how it's helping or what it's trying to kind of mediate. So I think that practice what you preach is so incredibly important. But I also think it gives you a little bit of credibility. If I'm an athlete and someone's giving me these techniques and it's clear they don't live out those things they're teaching, it might make me question, well, why should I do it? If you don't see it as valuable and important, why should I, as an athlete, view it as valuable and view it as important? So I try as much as I can to practice what I preach, especially because I think it's called sport and exercise psychology or sport and performance psychology, but I think in a lot of ways it's applicable to everything in my life.
Yeah.
It's not just about performance. It's like, oh, how can I use breathing to help me when I'm feeling really overwhelmed and stressed and anxious? How can I use self talk when I notice that I'm having that mental chatter that's maybe not super conducive to optimal performance as
Right.
a teacher, as a student, whatever that might be? I try as much as I can to practice what I preach just because I know it's so beneficial.
It demonstrates authenticity and
Hmm.
legitimacy.
Hmm.
To use more of a street slang, we say, are you legit? For those of you who are being introduced to Victoria today, she is legit. Something that I thought was quite beautiful, your TEDx talk, was that you did have the audience do a process. So it wasn't just about, let me give you information. Let me
Hmm.
teach you something. You actually walked everybody through a process. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, the idea really came from my own experiences as an athlete and just realizing the further I got into my sport. And what I mean by that is the further I climbed up that ladder of travel ball, high school, and then college softball, I started to notice that it was not fun for me anymore. It became just a job. I was going through the motions. It felt like something I needed to do because I had already dedicated 17 years of my life to it. So I have to finish. I have to close this chapter regardless of how miserable I am. That's where the idea stemmed from. The technique I introduce to people, and I do this in my psychology of injury class as well when we're talking about athletic identity, because in that class we talk a lot about how for a lot of athletes, their identity is their sport. Like when I was an
Mhm.
athlete, I was a softball player, and that was my identity. When you get an injury and that identity is suddenly stripped away from you, you kind of have to reflect on who am I outside of this identity.
Mm.
This activity was really meant to get people to reflect on something that was really important to them, and then reflect on why that's important to them. And I kind of have them go a few levels so they reflect on why that why is important to them, and then they do that about three more times. And I didn't get to chat with anyone in the audience about where they got with that. But typically, when I do this with clients, what we find is that when we get to that third why, they start to realize that the reason they play their sport or engage in their activity goes so much deeper than just being an athlete. And what they
Mm.
often start to realize is that their why can be fulfilled in so many different ways, not just being an athlete. My presentation didn't really focus on athletes, it focused more generally like how can we find that deeper purpose? How can we find that deeper passion? And then how can we live out that deeper purpose and that deeper passion? When I use it with clients, it's really looking at how can we recognize that our identity can be fulfilled in so many ways outside of just being an athlete.
I
And so it's
love
something I use
that.
all the time.
I really love that for several reasons. One is because we don't often know ourselves outside of the titles we give ourselves. So,
Hmm.
because we don't know who we are at the core, and this is something that I'm referencing for my upcoming book, which is a companion book to the TEDx talk, is this idea of understanding our soul needs, our growth needs, who we are, what we want, and why.
Hmm.
Right. So we often feel burnt out, disillusioned, disengaged because we are disconnected with the inside. That's that place within us that leads us to our whys, to different avenues in life. And then through this technique that you introduced and shared with the audience, we end up learning that sometimes our why is much deeper than, let's say, the sport we play or the career that we chose, right? And so I think it's fundamental because you're really getting to compass, which is something that I'm very passionate about. I call it addressing soul needs. You have a different
Okay.
name for it, but I think that we are both digging deep for similar items. And it is a great technique, a great process. Now, our TEDx talks are not ready yet. We don't know the exact release date, but when it is, it will be released by TED. I encourage you to watch Victoria's talk because it is filled with many gold nuggets that anybody could apply to their lives, regardless of whether you're an athlete or not. And I think that's the beautiful thing about helping people, whether it's through performance, whether it is through mental strength, through whatever it is. When you really care about people, you're going to help them get to their why from whichever perspective you're coming from so that they could feel better in terms of, okay, I can now be a stronger athlete, or okay, I have an injury, I can't play again. So what do I do now with my life?
It's all about finding that passion and purpose and helping them realize that they do bring so much more value than that single identity. It's interesting that you talked about this notion that so often we are defined by the titles that we hold, right? When someone asks, "Tell me about yourself," it's typically rooted in those titles that we hold. I was recently at the mindfulness workshop, and the presenter of this workshop had us do this similar activity. He said, "I want you to spend," I think it was a minute, in pods just like me and you would just ask me, "Who are you?" over and over again for a whole minute, and I had to keep answering that question. I noticed my tendency to constantly go to tangible things or tangible titles. I am a teacher. I am a postdoctoral student, right? These things feel like they're such an important part of my identity,
And
but
also lead to legitimacy in terms of productivity.
right. Yeah, and I very seldom focused on things that really do make me, right? Like I'm kind, I'm compassionate, I'm
Mhm.
empathetic, right? And it was so interesting that so much of who I am, even after I have this degree in sports psychology and this background, understanding that kind of deeper purpose, so much of it is still rooted in superficial level identities. I just thought that was really interesting. I just went to a mindfulness workshop and I still rooted my identity in identities that I felt proved my worth or my value in larger society, which is really fascinating. And I'm literally just reflecting on that.
Interesting. What's interesting is that we focus so much on those hard skills that connect us to identifiers, right? Or our identity. But what we're learning is that the human skills are just as important. Because if you're not relatable, you could be the most incredible. Let's go to a different industry to be more inclusive. I don't know, most incredible mathematician in the world. But if you can't relay those concepts to people in a human way, then there's a distance. I can't access you. I can't access the things that make you you. So
Mhm.
I don't know if I mentioned it to you last time we chatted, or I mentioned it to someone else who was a guest on the podcast, is that several years ago, I went to an interview and someone asked me to describe myself. I remember one of the first things I said is, I have an ethos of care. And it was blank stares.
Mhm.
People did not understand because they were waiting for me to define myself with hard skills. But equally important is being someone who cares about others, who cares about her team. That interview was just before people were starting to talk about the importance of mindfulness in the
Mhm.
workplace. Within a year later, all of a sudden, I'm on LinkedIn. I start seeing certificates for compassion in the workplace. And I was like, wait a minute, I've been talking about this before it
Mhm.
became popular, because one of the things that I noticed, having been a professor and later in a leadership role, that my hard skills mattered. They were integral to my success, but I never would have had said success without the human element, without actually caring about people, without galvanizing people, without being truly, genuinely interested in people. And I think we've all had experiences with someone who just really cared, will perhaps be strict and push us. I used to be that person. I remember I had someone who I used to work with. I was a timekeeper in the sense it's like, okay, these are our goals. These are our deadlines. We need this done by this day. How are we on that? And I would come in and be like, okay, we're behind schedules. We had a schedule. We had to produce a particular product or event. But in the middle of it, I was like, how are you today? Did you work through lunch? Let me buy you lunch.
Mhm.
Bringing in that mindfulness and care. I remember there was a time where a project I was working on got delayed by something completely outside of my control. We were partnering with a community group who I asked well in advance, I need XYZ from you by X date. And they were late. They finally gave us the items we needed during spring break. And we were set to launch a project upon returning from spring break.
Okay.
I said, oh, wow, how do we get the work prepared and done if everybody's on? I said, you know what? Well, I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna roll up my sleeves. I'm gonna get busy and dirty with my team. You know, we're
Mhm.
working head to head, toe to toe, if they're willing to come in. So I asked them, I said, I know you are on break. I didn't know if they were going to say yes, and I didn't know if they were going to say no. And I had many people say, yes, Cindy, we will help you. One person did one thing, another person did another thing. We pulled this project together through their hard work, through their efforts, and they never had to say yes. And the only reason they said yes to me was because I could be a pretty move us forward type of person, but I always cared. Every day I bought them lunch, making sure their needs were met. And I said, and after we launch this, after this opens, you know, take these days off, do this, do that. So we found a way to mitigate it, but they would have never said yes to me if it wasn't for that human element of, okay, yes, Cindy might be a little bit hard and pushy when it comes to deadlines, but she cares about me and she's going
Mhm.
to take care of me. It's always trying to find a delicate balance. And it isn't always easy to have that balance. It's taken me years to learn that balance. And sometimes I don't get it right. Sometimes I make mistakes like everybody else. But the fundamental thing here was those human skills that lead to those human relationships, right? It cannot be underscored.
We even talked about that a little bit last time, the importance of that relationship building. I think we talked about it in relation to the importance that I place on building relationships with the students in my courses. You reflect on any job, you look at a strength and conditioning coach like Henry. Relationship building is such a huge part of what he does. The hard skills are so important. He has to be knowledgeable, he has to have that education, he has to have those skills to be able to do that job. But relationship building is such a huge part of that as well. When you look at teaching, I have to have those hard skills. I have to have that education. I have to have that knowledge. But it's the relationship building that draws those students in, that engages them, and that makes them feel like you care about more than the outcome. And that's what I
Yes.
think is so important in cultivating in my classes. We're in a university system. So at the end of the day, the outcomes are important, right? They use the grades to decide whether you possess the knowledge to move on further or not. That's just the reality of the education system. So I try and foster in my classroom, like the outcome is important, but I care about you as a person and as a student, regardless of what your outcome is, because for me, it's about learning and growth. And the outcome is important. But if you get the outcome without any true learning or growth, then was that outcome really worth it, right? The example that I give is if you get an A in my class, but you didn't learn a single thing being in my class, then did I really do you a service? You got the grade, and that's amazing. But if you leave the classroom not feeling like you learned anything new or not feeling like you grew as an individual, then really what purpose did that class serve you?
I love that because one of the things this podcast is interested in is the idea of our human self and how we show up with our humanity in the workplace, with our family, with our friends. I have really only interacted with you a couple of times, but those times that I've interacted with you, I know who you are. I have a very clear sense of your humanity, of your spirit. Now, I may not know specific things about you. That's only something that comes with time and constant interaction. But from the times that we have interacted, I know you are ethical. I know you have integrity. I know you're a hard worker. There's certain things that have become clear. And in addition to that, you have a very openness about you. You're very open, saying, these have been my struggles, but this is what I've learned. As that openness makes me want to relate to you. I've met other people who are a bit more shut down, more reserved, and there's nothing
Mhm.
wrong with that. But it just doesn't allow me to get a sense of who they are. It doesn't mean they're not incredible people, but when we open ourselves up to who we are and being okay with that, we allow ourselves to be seen. And when we allow ourselves to be seen, people feel comfortable and they allow themselves to be seen. So I'm sure you've had those students who sit in the back and are very shy. They don't really allow themselves to be seen for XYZ reasons. But then with one of those students, you might have been, hey, we'll say Adam. Hey, Adam, how are you today? Oh, I'm great. Thank you. So as you are open and they start to feel that, they become to open up. It does affect learning. And just like it affects learning, it affects productivity in the workplace. Because I've seen both sides of being in a leadership role and in a teaching role, how you relate to people, how you allow yourself to connect with people and understand people is going to be mirrored back to you one way or another. And you're a
Yeah, and I
psychologist, so you can talk about this, right?
yeah, I mean, I got my undergrad in psychology, so it's been a really long time since I've looked into just general psychology. I'm more sports psych at this point, but I think it's really come down to those small gestures and small acts of compassion and empathy. I remember one time, very new into teaching, I think it was before I had even graduated with my PhD. I was student teaching at this point, and I had a particular student that had missed 4 classes. I make it a point to make sure I know every single student in my class. So that way, when they do miss, you notice when someone's not there, when a presence is missing a little bit. I just reached out to this student and I prefaced my email with, I'm in no way trying to make you feel bad for missing class. I'm in no way punishing you for missing class. I want to make sure that you're okay. I want to make sure that you're doing okay. And I want to see if there's anything that I can do that might help you in this process. And they emailed me back. It was a really pivotal moment in my career as a new teacher, but they emailed me back and were so grateful that someone had even reached out to them to ask why they had
Mm,
missed so many classes. They voiced that so many of their other professors had deemed them irresponsible. They're just missing class. They don't care about class, and had actually opened up about the fact that their partner was in the hospital and they were managing all of that. And it was in that moment that I started to realize that what seems like a small act to me, like that took me 4 minutes out of my day
right.
to send that email and just ask, like, hey, I noticed you haven't been in class. Like, is everything
Mhm.
okay? Is there anything I can do? Can I support you? Created that branch where a student then felt comfortable to, as you mentioned, reciprocate that. Like, thank you for reaching out and thank you for checking in on me. And I'm really struggling and I want to pass your class and I'm really interested about the things that you're teaching. But mentally, I can't juggle what's happening in my personal life and what's happening in my educational life. Going back to your point, I do think it's those small acts that create that kind of human connection that I believe allow you to be more effective with those
Right.
hard skills. I created that relationship, and now those hard skills are going to be more effective because we kind of have that branch between us too.
Yeah, I love it. And I love that you had the emotional maturity, wisdom, and intelligence to say, let me find out what is going on before I make a judgment. And when I say that you had these qualities, it doesn't have to do with you being a young professor at the time? Because I've met people across age groups, across the different hierarchy of positions, whether it's someone who might be an assistant professor, fully tenured, to a dean, to a VP. Some of them have had, and some haven't. I appreciate that you did it because you impacted a life. And sometimes we forget that impacting one life can have a ripple effect. When you think of someone like Albert Einstein, we all know about his struggles, right? He had a speech impediment.
Hmm.
He was not a traditionally successful student. He struggled as a student and even failing math. Those struggles may have been related to the approaches that they had, but at some point, something changed. There might have been someone who helped him, but had he not had the support that he needed, he may have not become Einstein as we know him. We do know that he had many pivotal people in his life, such as his first wife, who was equally brilliant in physics and mathematics. So helping one life can completely, it could be a domino effect, because by you reaching out to the student, maybe the student's partner was worried about their partner school. Oh, you're missing school because of me. Well, I spoke with professor, and yes, I'm still responsible for my work, but she's helping me navigate this. So then that person who's going through his health issues then has a little bit of relief. We sometimes forget the power that we hold with those little acts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it took me a while to realize that as a teacher. I felt not that teachers are insignificant, but it kind of felt like the decisions that I make as a teacher are pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. I quickly realized, as you mentioned, that one small act can domino into not only impacting them, but impacting someone else, and can also potentially break the cycle in some ways. I remember when I was a student, there were times where I would go to class after a really awful thing happened, or I would go to class really, really sick out of the fear of what might happen if I didn't go. Not all of my professors were like this, but I definitely had some professors that did not care why you missed class. You had missed class, and that was irresponsible of you. And that's a really hard place to be in as a student when you're trying to balance. My personal well-being is very important. My mental well-being is very important. My physical well-being is very important, but also my education is really important. So to feel like those two things were colliding was really challenging. In some ways, it's helping to break that cycle of you can take care of your mental, physical, and emotional health and still achieve your educational goals. Those things don't have to
Be in
collide.
conflict. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Those two things don't have to be in conflict. I think we're starting to see academia shift into that more holistic outlook. Like, this person sitting in front of me is not just a student, they are a million other things. How do we
Yeah.
navigate that and best support them? That's really great, because it is a full human being in front of me and not just a student. I understand that my class is not the only thing they have going on. They probably have a million other stressors. How can I make sure that this class is not a cause for
Yeah,
stress?
I love that you're talking about this shift because I see it too. I'm about to give away my age. When I was an undergraduate in the 90s, this was before email. Email had started in the 90s. It just wasn't as widespread, and we did not
Right.
use it to communicate. I remember if I wanted to see a professor, I had to show up during office hours, and sometimes there was a line, and there was a probability that if I got there too late, I would not be able to see the professor if there were other students and office hours were over. That did happen to me a couple of
Oh
times.
no.
And there were
Yeah.
other times I went to office hours and there was nobody there, so I was able to communicate. I also remember I once had a professor, it was a class on diplomacy that I took. I have a double major, and one of them is in international relations. He is former military, great mind, great strategist, great diplomat, but very old school. The class was at 8 o'clock in the morning, and stand in front of the door with a stopwatch. Once it was 8 o'clock sharp, he'd press it, close the door, and lock it. If you were late, you had to knock. and he may or may not let you in. If he let you in and had to stop the class, it was terribly uncomfortable. And I'm not saying that those were all professors or all classes,
Right.
because it would be a fallacy to say that. However, I remember that because that's something that stuck in my psyche. I also had some really wonderful professors. I once had a professor who I convinced to join the intramural softball team. So now Cindy playing softball is not like you playing softball, Victoria. I could barely hit the ball, but it seemed like a fun thing to do to be part of this intramural team. We did have some really wonderful professors, but we had some really strict ones where whatever was happening in your life, it didn't matter. You had a job to do. And the way some things happened for us was if you had to give a presentation, you showed up in a suit. This is the East Coast, so it's different cultural expectations in higher education in the East Coast versus the West Coast. In the 90s, my friends in California didn't have to do that, but I did. Completely different experiences. My point is that I've seen these shifts and I think they're great because I think it's going to bring more success to students. Seeing their humanities and their needs does not negate the fact that, yes, they have to learn. Because you want to pass this class, you need to do the work, right? You'll receive compassion and kindness, but that doesn't mean it's a free pass. So I think
Hmm.
that finding that balance, it's a beautiful thing. And it's really uplifting and inspiring that you're doing that.
And it's interesting as you were talking, I was thinking about it. It's not just the balance between hard skills and these more human centered skills. We've both been in the shoes of a student and we've both been in the shoes of a professor. And I think as a professor, it also becomes a balance of your own well being. I want to
Yes.
show this care, compassion, and empathy. And I want to extend myself as much as I can to the students I work with. But also, I'm a human being that
Yes.
has psychological needs and emotional needs, and how do you balance that? The story that you gave about your professor with office hours, and once office hours were done, the door is closed. I think in my shoes, that's something I really kind of juggle with is like, how far do I extend my office
Mm-hmm.
hours while still making sure that I'm taking care of myself and my personal life as much as I can? I try to, when I get home, make sure that I'm home and I'm fully present at
Yes.
home and I'm fully present with my partner. It's such a tricky balance
It
of that
is.
too.
It absolutely is. And I'm so happy you brought that up because we also need to take care of our personal needs. Let me share something with you that I used to do. This was a Cindy rule. I did have several rules in the classroom. I tried to be kind, but I also did have rules. One of them was if it was the day before a midterm or a final, I will answer questions up until 5 o'clock the day before. After 5 o'clock, I will not answer any questions because you had time to email me. The reason I came up with that rule was because I would have people emailing me at midnight. I once had a student email me 10 minutes for class with the exam, and I did not respond because it's 10 minutes before class. I'm preparing for class. This student then later went and complained to my department chair. And my department chair said, Cindy, are you ignoring student emails? So this is something serious. And I said, excuse me a minute. Let me pull up that email. That email was 10 minutes before an exam. I don't think I'm expected to reply to that when I'm preparing. And the chair said, no, you are not. The student did not specify that he emailed you 10 minutes before that was part of my learning curves. I remember saying, this is a hard rule. If you email me up until 5 o'clock, I may not respond to you until 7, but I will respond to you. I will respond to any email that comes in before this time. After that, I am sorry you had the time.
Hmm.
And at first, there was guilt, like, oh, they need me. Come on, Cindy. I mean, what are you doing at 5:30? It's not about what you're
Hmm.
doing, but you do need boundaries. It goes back to that self-care. Otherwise,
Hmm.
you're answering emails at odd hours of the night. You're not sleeping. You feel stressed out. You're thinking to yourself, did I explain that concept right? Did I do this? Did I do that? chances are you did the best that you could, but at some point, the responsibility is on their end.
Yeah, and that's a lesson that took me a long time to learn, like setting those boundaries. I think as long as you make them clear at the front end, they can be really helpful. A boundary that I recently started implementing, and I will admit I could be better about respecting the boundary that I have set. But one of the boundaries that I set is Friday after through Monday at 8 a.m., I don't check my email. And that's just a form of self care. Weekends are the only time that I get to take care of myself and catch up on things and spend time with my partner. We're both going a million miles a minute Monday through Friday. That's a boundary that I make very clear at the front end of class. If you feel like something is an emergency over the weekend, send me an email and I'll check it Monday morning and we'll talk about how to move forward with that, right? So if an assignment was due Sunday at 11 and you emailed me Sunday morning, just kind of explaining, I just don't feel like I can do this at the level that I want to by 11:59. I'll get back to you Monday morning and we'll figure out how to move forward from there. Don't stress because I'm not emailing you back over the weekend. Send me the email still and then we'll figure it out come Monday. But nothing's an emergency, right? Especially when we're talking about education. Nothing's an emergency.
Yes,
We can
and
always figure it out.
exactly. And that's why you have timelines. Your syllabus is a timeline of due dates,
Mhm.
and everybody knows the timeline day one. I appreciate that you brought up the issue of self-care. We touched upon so many things, but I think one of the hardest things that we can do, it's also one of the easiest, is care for ourselves, for our mental well-being, our emotional well-being, our physical well-being. It's a discipline. It sounds kind of strange to say self-care is a discipline, but it is. That boundary that you imposed after 5 o'clock on Fridays through Monday morning, I'm off the clock. I will not answer emails. And that's a discipline to, okay, but is it important? It is a
Mhm.
discipline, but the more you do it, we find those balances because we cannot give from an empty cup. I think it makes us more productive in our professions when we establish those boundaries, that discipline. It doesn't mean that they're perfect, but it gives you the opportunity to step back and say, you know what, this weekend is about my family. This weekend is
Mhm.
about my loved ones. I remember that the times when I haven't done that has been the times where I've gotten sick. Our immune system becomes weaker when we don't care
Mhm.
for ourselves. The old-fashioned hardline way was like, it doesn't matter, push through. But look at where that has gotten us through a crisis of lack of self-care. And I think it's no accident that one of the industries that is growing the most, and it's over $1 billion industry, is self-improvement and self-care because they weren't priorities 10, 20, 30 years ago. It doesn't mean that we're going to stop doing our job or being productive, but it just means that, hey, our personal wellness matters.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes it's at least when I first started setting those boundaries and realizing the importance of self-care, you feel a little bit guilty. You feel like, well, I should be using this time for something else. And sometimes self-care can feel a little bit selfish. Like I could be helping a student or I could be class prepping or I could be grading, but it goes back to that point of you can't pour from an empty cup. If I'm not taking care of myself, how can I then give my best self to other people? How can I then give my best self to grading? How can I then give my best self to students? And so for me, it really took changing my perspective. Self care is not selfish. Self care is a way for me to ensure that I'm better helping the people around me.
Ah,
And that's helped me.
it's been very inspirational to hear you speak, Victoria. When I was you, I did not have the wisdom you did. It took me a little bit longer. It is very inspirational for me because I do feel that I'm not that much older, but your generation is a little bit better than my generation. So I'm Generation X, you're millennial, if I'm not
Mhm.
mistaken. And I believe your generation figured it out a little bit faster than my generation. And it's inspirational to see that because then I see someone rising like yourself and saying, yes, she's doing it. And she's going to be able to rise more than I did because she's figured this out, you know? And because the whole point of being leaders is not to keep people below you. You want people to rise above you and push them forward. And not that I need to do that to you because you're quite empowered on your own. But for me, it's truly beautiful to see, yes, she's doing it. I wish I would have done it earlier, but it doesn't mean we can't do it now. So thank you. And I hope that this summer gives you the nourishment, the care, and the reset that you need to reflect, but also enjoy life so that when the academic semester begins this fall, you are working from a full cup.
Thank you so much. It is always a pleasure to share this space with you and to have these conversations and to just be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Victoria.